I walked out of New York's busiest hospital after a hellish 17-hour shift. When I stepped into the house, my legs were trembling. But what welcomed me was not peace, but my son's cruel voice. "You are jobless. You are a nobody." I didn't say a single word. I just went into the kitchen and poured my tea. At that moment, the news anchor on the TV started speaking. And when my son looked at the screen, the glass in his hand fell to the floor, because the mother he had just called useless was the lead character in the biggest disaster New York had seen. But the real shock wasn't this. When the news ended, our doorbell rang. The person at the door had brought that miracle that would change our lives forever. You will never forget what happened that night and the life lesson my son learned. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe, because the end of this story is much more than you can guess. I am Emma. I am 42 years old, and I have forgotten what sleep is for the last 10 years. I spent my youth, my beauty, even my own dreams in a hospital corridor, saving other people's lives. Why? Because I wanted my son Dylan to live that life I couldn't live. My husband Michael. He used to be the pillar of the house, but ever since his company suffered a cyber attack, he is like a ghost inside the house. Salaries are not being deposited. Bills are piling up like mountains. I see the burden on Michael's shoulders. That's why I stay silent. One of us must stay strong, I say to myself. That person is me. Extra shifts, emergency room rushes, just so Dylan can go to that university he wants so much, the one whose annual fee is worth a fortune. That morning, I had come out of a 17-hour shift. On the apron I was wearing, there was the pain, sweat, and hope of strangers. My bones were aching. All I wanted was a soft pillow and a voice saying, "Welcome home, Mom." I opened the door. I was expecting a heavy silence inside, but what I encountered was a storm. Dylan was pacing back and forth in the corridor with a crumpled paper in his hand. Things had gone bad at school. He had fought with his guidance counselor, and he was looking for a target to explode at that moment. And that tired woman who walked through the door, eyes bloodshot, was the perfect target. As soon as he saw me, he started shouting, "Did you come late again? You were always late anyway. The guidance counselor wanted a parent meeting. You weren't there again." I put my bag aside. I was too tired to even make a sound. "Son, I was working," was all I could say. This answer seemed to drive him even crazier. He walked up to me, looked into my eyes, and said that sentence that shattered my heart. "Working? Do you call this working? Dad's company is sinking, and you are tearing yourself apart for 3 pennies, but you are not at home. Mom, you are actually jobless. You are not at home. You are not in our lives. You are just a shadow." As I headed towards the kitchen, the sound from the TV that was left on suddenly changed the atmosphere in the room. The anchor's voice echoed in the room. The toll could have been heavier in the panic following the terrible gas leak in the New York subway this morning. However, a secret hero at the scene prevented the disaster. Dylan fell silent. Michael lifted his head, because the image on the screen, although blurry and shaky, was very familiar. There was a woman in a blue uniform running amidst the smoke on the screen. That was me. In the footage, I was giving CPR to a small child who couldn't breathe. Right next to me, an old man was lying on the ground. I was trying to stop his bleeding by tearing my shirt. While people were running away, I was running into the flames and gas. The reporter was explaining excitedly. Eyewitnesses are talking about this nurse who carried 12 people to the safe zone alone before the medical teams arrived. This hero, whose identity has not yet been determined, took off her own mask and put it on a young person having an asthma attack and continued to intervene until she fainted. The camera zoomed in. My face was covered in soot. My hair was messy. But that determined expression, that expression was an Emma even I had forgotten. At that moment, the interview of a man I saved that morning, who was wearing a suit and was quite stylish but in a miserable state, at that moment, appeared on the screen. The man looked at the camera and said, I don't know her name. It just said Emma on her name tag. If it weren't for that woman, I wouldn't be alive right now. She is my guardian angel. I need to find her, no matter the cost." There was not a sound in the kitchen. Dylan's face had turned white. His mother, whom he had just called useless and humiliated as jobless, had turned into a legend in the heart of the city. The water glass in Michael's hand was trembling. Dylan stammered, "Mom, were you inside that hell?" I didn't answer right away because, honestly, I didn't know what to say in that moment. And more importantly, I was so exhausted that even forming words felt like climbing a mountain. But when I looked into Dylan's eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, something that had disappeared behind all the teenage rebellion and stress and anger. I saw fear, genuine fear, and maybe, for the first time in months, I saw that he was actually looking at me, really seeing me, not just as the tired woman who came home late or the shadow wandering around the house, but as a person, as his mother, as someone who could have died that morning, and he would never have had the chance to take back those words he had just thrown at me like daggers. I nodded slowly and said in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, "Yes, I was there. I was coming home from my shift, and the subway station was right there. People were screaming, running, there was smoke everywhere, and I saw a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old. He was on the ground, his lips were turning blue, and I just did what I had to do, what I was trained to do, what any nurse would do." Dylan took a step back. His hand went to his mouth, and I could see tears forming in his eyes, real tears, not the angry, frustrated tears of a teenager who didn't get his way, but tears of genuine emotion, of realization, of regret. And Michael, my husband, who had been so distant and locked in his own world of work problems and financial stress, he stood up from the couch and walked toward me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it pride? Was it fear? Was it anger that I had put myself in danger? Was it all of those things mixed together into something overwhelming and confusing? The news continued playing in the background, and now they were showing more footage I didn't even remember because everything had happened so fast. In that moment of crisis, time had moved differently. Seconds had felt like hours, and hours had felt like seconds. And there I was on the screen, my uniform torn and dirty, carrying an elderly woman on my back toward the exit while guiding 3 other people with my free hand. And the reporter was saying something about how I had stayed until the very end, until the professional emergency teams arrived, until every single person in that station had been accounted for, and only then had I allowed myself to collapse. Only then had I let someone else take care of me for a change. Michael reached me, and without saying a word, he pulled me into his arms, and I felt his body shaking, and I realized he was crying. My strong, stoic husband who never showed emotion, who'd been carrying the weight of his failing company and our family's financial troubles on his shoulders without complaint. He was crying into my hair and holding me so tight I could barely breathe, and he kept saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't know, I should have known, I should have been there, I should have been paying attention." And I wanted to tell him it was okay, that he didn't need to apologize, that we were all just doing our best to survive. But I couldn't speak because my own tears were finally coming, tears I had been holding back for months, maybe years, tears of exhaustion and loneliness and frustration and relief all mixed together. Dylan stood frozen in the hallway watching us, and I could see his mind working, processing, trying to reconcile the mother he had just screamed at with the hero on the television screen, trying to understand how those 2 versions of the same person could exist simultaneously. And maybe that was the moment he started to grow up, really grow up, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. The moment he realized that adults aren't just obstacles or authority figures or sources of frustration, but real people with their own struggles and sacrifices and moments of extraordinary courage that happen when no one is watching, when there's no praise or recognition, just the quiet knowledge that you did the right thing because it needed to be done. The news anchor came back on and said they were trying to identify the mysterious nurse hero, that the man she saved, whose name was apparently Richard Thornton, and who was some kind of important businessman, had already started a campaign to find her, had posted on social media, had contacted the hospital, had even hired a private investigator because he wanted to thank her properly, wanted the world to know her name, wanted to make sure she was recognized for what she had done. And I felt a strange mix of emotions about that because part of me was proud, yes, proud that I had made a difference, that my years of training and sacrifice had paid off in that critical moment, but another part of me just wanted to hide, wanted to go back to being invisible, because being seen meant being vulnerable, meant opening myself up to judgment and questions and attention I wasn't sure I could handle. Michael finally released me from his embrace and held me at arm's length, looking into my eyes with an intensity that made me uncomfortable because we hadn't really looked at each other, really seen each other in so long, and he said, "Emma, why didn't you call me? Why didn't you tell me what happened? I've been sitting in my office all day dealing with stupid conference calls and budget meetings while you were literally saving lives and nearly dying yourself. How did we get here? How did we become so disconnected that something this enormous could happen and I wouldn't even know about it?" I didn't have an answer for him because the truth was too complicated, too layered with months and years of small disconnections and missed moments and conversations we didn't have because we were too tired or too stressed or too busy just trying to keep everything from falling apart. And sometimes in a marriage, you wake up one day and realize you've been living parallel lives instead of a shared life. And you don't know exactly when that shift happened or how to shift back. You just know that somewhere along the way you lost each other in the chaos of bills and work and raising a child and all the million tiny decisions and compromises that slowly erode the foundation you thought was unshakable. Dylan finally moved, finally broke his frozen stance in the hallway, and he walked toward me slowly, hesitantly, like he was approaching something fragile that might break if he moved too fast. And when he reached me, he didn't say anything at first. He just wrapped his arms around me and buried his face in my shoulder, and I could feel him trembling, could feel the weight of his regret and shame and love all pouring out in that embrace. And he whispered so quietly, I almost didn't hear it. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. I was angry about school and scared about college and taking it out on you, and you almost died today. And the last thing I said to you was that you're useless. And what if you had died? What if that had been the last conversation we ever had? I would never have forgiven myself. Never." I stroked his hair. This boy who was almost a man now, this child I had sacrificed so much for, and I said, "It's okay, baby. I know you didn't mean it. I know you're under a lot of pressure, we all are, but we're going to be okay. We're going to figure this out together, as a family, the way we should have been doing all along instead of each of us suffering alone in our own private hells." The doorbell rang suddenly, cutting through the emotional intensity of the moment, and we all froze, looked at each other with confusion because we weren't expecting anyone. It was late evening, and our friends and family knew better than to drop by unannounced, and Michael went to answer it while Dylan and I stayed in the kitchen, still holding each other, and I heard Michael's surprised voice from the front door saying, "Can I help you?" And then another voice, a male voice that sounded vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place it at first, saying, "I'm looking for Emma Walker. I was told this is her address. I'm Richard Thornton. She saved my life this morning, and I need to see her. I need to thank her properly." My heart started pounding because this was it. This was the moment everything was about to change. I could feel it in my bones, that strange electric sensation you get when you're standing on the edge of something significant. And Dylan pulled back and looked at me with wide eyes and said, "Mom, that's the guy from the TV, the one who said you're his guardian angel." And I nodded and smoothed down my hair and tried to make myself look more presentable, even though I was still in my dirty clothes from the morning, still had soot probably smudged on my face, still looked like exactly what I was, a woman who had been through hell and was barely holding it together. Michael led Richard Thornton into our modest living room, and the contrast was almost comical. Here was this man in what was probably a $5,000 suit, even though it was rumpled and stained from the morning's chaos, standing in our small apartment with its worn furniture and peeling paint and the pile of unpaid bills on the coffee table that I quickly tried to cover with a magazine, and he looked completely out of place, but also somehow humbled, diminished, like the near-death experience had stripped away some of his polished businessman veneer and left something more human underneath. He saw me standing in the kitchen doorway, and his entire face transformed, lit up with something that looked almost like reverence. And he crossed the room quickly and grabbed both of my hands in his before I could even think to pull away. And he said with such intensity that it was almost overwhelming, "Emma Walker, I have been searching for you all day. I have used every resource at my disposal, called in every favor, because I needed to find you, needed to look you in the eye and tell you that you gave me back my life today. You gave me back everything. My wife, my children, my future. All of it was slipping away in that smoke and chaos, and you reached in and pulled me back." I felt deeply uncomfortable with this level of gratitude and attention. It wasn't why I had done what I did. I didn't need thanks or recognition. I had just been doing my job, doing what any decent person would do in that situation, and I tried to pull my hands away gently and say something about how it was nothing, how anyone would have done the same, but he wouldn't let me diminish it, wouldn't let me brush it off. He said, "No, you don't understand. Most people ran away. They ran for their lives as they should have. But you ran toward the danger. You put yourself between death and strangers who meant nothing to you, and I need to know why. I need to understand what kind of person does that so I can try to be more like that myself." Dylan and Michael stood watching this interaction with expressions of shock and confusion, and I realized they were seeing me through this stranger's eyes, seeing me as something other than just mom or wife, seeing me as this person who had apparently done something extraordinary. And maybe for the first time, they were understanding the weight of what I carried every single day, not just in emergency situations, but in all the small ways I had been sacrificing and giving and pouring myself out for years without acknowledgement or appreciation. Richard finally released my hands and took a step back, composing himself, and he said, "I'm sorry, I'm overwhelming you. It's just that all day I've been thinking about what happened and about the fact that I have resources, significant resources, and I spend most of my time using those resources to make more money, to build my business empire, to acquire things I don't need. And then this morning I was seconds away from death, and none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was this woman I had never met who decided my life was worth saving. And I realized I've been living wrong, investing in all the wrong things. And I want to change that. I need to change that, and it starts with you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, thick and expensive looking, and he held it out to me and said, "This is a small token of my gratitude. It's not enough. It could never be enough. But it's a start. Please take it. Please let me do this one thing to say thank you." I stared at the envelope like it might bite me, deeply suspicious and uncomfortable because I had learned long ago that nothing in life comes free, that gifts from wealthy strangers always have strings attached, expectations buried in the fine print, and I shook my head and said, "I can't accept that. I didn't save you for money. I saved you because you needed saving, that's all. There's nothing more complicated about it than that." Richard smiled, a sad kind of smile that suggested he had expected this response, and he said, "I know you didn't do it for money. That's precisely why I want to give it to you, because you're the kind of person who would never ask for anything in return, who would just go home and keep living your quiet life of service and sacrifice. And the world needs more people like you, not fewer. So please, let me help you the way you helped me. Let me do something that might make your life even a fraction easier." Michael stepped forward then. his practical businessman instincts overriding whatever emotional turmoil he was feeling. And he said carefully, "Mr. Thornton, we appreciate the gesture. We really do. But you have to understand that Emma is very proud, very independent. She's not comfortable accepting charity. Maybe there's another way you could express your gratitude that would feel less like a handout and more like, I don't know, an opportunity?" Richard's eyes lit up at that, and he nodded enthusiastically, like Michael had just said exactly the right thing. And he started pacing our small living room, gesticulating as he spoke, clearly a man used to brainstorming and problem-solving and turning obstacles into opportunities. Yes, exactly, an opportunity. I like that framing much better, he said. And then he turned to me with sudden focus and asked, "Emma, what do you want? What's the dream you've been putting off? What would you do if money and circumstances weren't obstacles?" I was caught completely off guard by the question because honestly, I had stopped allowing myself to dream years ago, had packed away my wants and desires in some locked box in the back of my mind because dreaming about impossible things just made the daily reality harder to bear. And I stammered something about how I was fine, how we were managing, how we didn't need anything special. But Dylan spoke up then, his voice stronger than before, filled with a determination I hadn't heard from him in a long time. And he said, "Mom wants to go back to school. She's always wanted to become a nurse practitioner, to have her own practice, to do more than just follow doctor's orders. But she gave all that up to pay for my future. She's been working herself to death so I could go to college instead of using that money for her own education." I shot Dylan a look that was half gratitude and half betrayal because he had just exposed something deeply personal, something I had never intended for this wealthy stranger to know. And Richard seized on it immediately, his business mind clearly working through the possibilities. "A nurse practitioner. That's perfect. That's exactly the kind of concrete goal we can work with," Richard said, pulling out his phone and starting to type notes to himself with the efficiency of someone who was used to making decisions and implementing them immediately. "I have connections at Columbia, at NYU, at every major nursing program in the city. I can make some calls, get you into an accelerated program, cover the tuition, whatever you need. And in return, all I ask is that when you have your own practice, you remember this moment. Remember that someone invested in you because they believed in what you could become. And then you do the same for someone else when you have the chance. You pay it forward. You create a chain of goodness that extends far beyond just the two of us." It sounded too good to be true. Sounded like one of those fairy tale moments that don't actually happen in real life. And I felt myself resisting it, even as part of me desperately wanted to reach out and grab this opportunity with both hands, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, the universe was finally giving me something back after years of giving and getting nothing in return. Michael put his hand on my shoulder, squeezed gently, and when I looked at him, I saw tears in his eyes again, and he nodded, giving me permission, giving me encouragement, telling me without words that it was okay to want something for myself, that I deserved this, that I should take it. "There's more," Richard continued, his momentum building as the ideas clearly flowed faster and faster in his mind. "I've been thinking all day about what I want to do differently, how I want to redirect my resources and energy, and I've decided to start a foundation dedicated to recognizing and supporting everyday heroes like you, people who don't make headlines, who don't get awards and recognition, who just quietly go about making the world better in small ways that add up to something extraordinary. I want you to be the first recipient, the face of this initiative. I want to tell your story and use it to inspire others. And more than that, I want to hire you as a consultant to help me identify other people like you who deserve support and recognition. And I'll pay you a salary for that work, a real salary that will let you cut back on those 17-hour shifts and actually have time for your family." Dylan was staring at Richard with an expression that mixed hope and disbelief, and I could see him doing the mental math, calculating what this could mean for our family, for his college tuition, for the crushing financial pressure that had been suffocating all of us for months. And Michael was nodding slowly, his businessman brain analyzing the offer from every angle, looking for the catch, the hidden strings, but seemingly finding nothing except genuine gratitude and an opportunity too good to refuse. I felt dizzy, overwhelmed, like the exhaustion from the 17-hour shift and the emotional chaos of the evening, and now this impossible offer were all crashing over me in waves I couldn't quite process, and I had to sit down on the couch before my legs gave out completely. Richard immediately looked concerned and asked if I needed water or medical attention, the irony of which wasn't lost on me considering I was the nurse and he was the businessman. But I waved him off and just took a few deep breaths, trying to center myself, trying to figure out if this was really happening or if I had fallen asleep at the hospital and was having some kind of stress-induced fever dream. "Mr. Thornton," I finally said, my voice steadier than I felt, "this is incredibly generous, more generous than I know how to accept. But I need you to understand something. I didn't save you because I wanted anything in return. I saved you because that's what I do. That's who I am. And if I accept this offer, if I let you change my life like this, I need to know that it's not going to change who I am at my core, that I'm not going to become someone who only helps people when there's something in it for me." Richard crouched down in front of me so we were at eye level, and the sincerity in his face was unmistakable as he said, "Emma, people like you don't change. That's what makes you special. You could have all the money in the world and you'd still run into burning buildings to save strangers. That's not something that can be bought or corrupted. It's woven into your DNA, and that's exactly why I want to support you. Because I know you'll use any resources I give you to do even more good in the world, not less." The envelope was still sitting on the coffee table between us, unopened, and Richard pushed it gently toward me and said, "At least look at it, see what's inside, and then make your decision. But I'm not leaving here tonight until you promise me you'll think about the bigger offer, the foundation, the consulting work, the school program, all of it, because Emma, I'm serious about this. I'm going to do this with or without you, but it would mean infinitely more if you were part of it from the beginning." I picked up the envelope with trembling hands and opened it slowly, and inside was a check. And when I saw the amount, my vision actually blurred for a moment because it was more money than I made in 6 months of brutal hospital shifts, more money than we had in our savings account, more money than I had ever held in my hands at one time. Michael looked over my shoulder, and I heard him inhale sharply, and Dylan tried to peek at it, but I folded it quickly, my mind racing through all the things this money could do, the bills it could pay, the pressure it could relieve, the breathing room it could give us while we figured out the rest of our lives. "This is too much," I whispered, but Richard shook his head firmly and said, "It's not even close to enough. It's not even close to the value of a human life, my life, which you saved without hesitation. So please, take it, use it. Let it be the first step toward the life you deserve, the life you've been building for your family through years of sacrifice that nobody was acknowledging until today." The next morning, everything felt surreal, like I had stepped through some invisible portal into an alternate version of my life, where impossible things became possible, and strangers became angels, and all the years of struggle suddenly crystallized into meaning. I woke up earlier than usual despite having barely slept, my mind too active and electric with possibility to fully surrender to rest, and I found myself standing in the kitchen, making coffee while staring at Richard Thornton's business card that he had left on the counter, along with his personal cell phone number and an instruction to call him any time, day or night, when I was ready to discuss the foundation and the consulting position. Michael came downstairs looking more rested than he had in months, and there was something different in his eyes, a lightness that I realized had been missing for so long I had forgotten it used to be there. And he wrapped his arms around me from behind and kissed my neck and whispered, "I'm proud of you." in a way that made tears spring to my eyes because I couldn't remember the last time someone had said those words to me and actually meant them. Dylan appeared next, shuffling into the kitchen in his pajamas, and the angry, defensive teenager from yesterday had been replaced by someone quieter, more thoughtful, someone who looked at me with new eyes and said, "Mom, I'm sorry about what I said. I know I already apologized, but I need to say it again in the daylight when we're not all emotional and crazy. I was so wrong, so incredibly wrong, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it up to you." We sat together at the breakfast table, something we hadn't done in months because our schedules were always misaligned, and someone was always rushing out the door or coming home too late to eat together. And there was a peace in the ordinariness of it that felt more valuable than Richard Thornton's check sitting upstairs in my bedroom drawer. Michael opened up his laptop and said he wanted to look up nursing practitioner programs with me, wanted to help me research options and requirements and timelines, wanted to be involved in this next chapter of my life instead of being a distant observer dealing with his own crises. And Dylan volunteered to help me put together application materials and write my personal statement. Said he was actually really good at writing essays and had won an award for it last year that he'd never mentioned because we'd been too busy and disconnected to celebrate small victories. The check would take care of Dylan's first year of college with money left over for our most pressing debts, and Richard's job offer would provide steady income that meant I could finally cut back to normal 40-hour work weeks instead of grinding myself into dust with double and triple shifts. And the thought of having actual free time, actual space to breathe and think and be something other than an exhausted zombie moving through life on autopilot was almost frightening in its unfamiliarity. My phone rang mid-morning, and it was the hospital administrator, a woman named Patricia, who had always been professional but distant, and her voice was warm with an enthusiasm I'd never heard before as she said the hospital had been flooded with calls and messages about me, that the subway incident had gone viral on social media, that reporters were asking for interviews, and that the hospital wanted to feature me in their next fundraising campaign and offer me a promotion to head nurse of the emergency department with a significant raise and better benefits. Part of me wanted to feel validated by this sudden recognition, wanted to bask in the attention after years of being invisible and underappreciated. But another part of me felt almost angry that it had taken a dramatic public rescue for anyone to notice the quiet, everyday heroism I'd been performing for a decade, the countless lives I'd touched and saved in ways that would never make the news or trend on Twitter. I told Patricia I needed time to think about it, that I had some other opportunities I was considering, and I could hear the surprise in her voice because nurses like me, overworked and underpaid and desperate for any scrap of advancement, weren't supposed to have options, weren't supposed to be able to negotiate or deliberate. We were supposed to be grateful for whatever crumbs the system threw our way. Richard called that afternoon and invited our entire family to dinner at one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, the kind of place where reservations required weeks of advance notice and connections we absolutely didn't have. And when we arrived that evening, the maitre d' treated us like royalty, leading us to a private room where Richard was waiting with his wife Helen and their 2 teenage daughters. Helen was elegant and warm, immediately embracing me like we were old friends, and she said Richard hadn't stopped talking about me since the incident, that he'd been transformed by the experience, that he'd already started making calls about the foundation and had lined up 3 major donors who were excited about the concept of celebrating everyday heroes. The daughters, Madison and Sophie, were polite and curious, asking me questions about what it was like to be a nurse, what had gone through my mind during the subway rescue, whether I'd been scared, and I found myself opening up to them in a way I hadn't expected, telling them that yes, I'd been terrified, that fear and courage weren't opposites but companions, that being brave didn't mean not feeling afraid. It meant feeling afraid and acting anyway because something bigger than yourself demanded it. Over a meal that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget, Richard laid out his vision for the foundation in detail, pulling out charts and projections and a draft mission statement that he'd apparently stayed up all night working on. And his passion was infectious, making me believe that maybe this crazy idea could actually work, that maybe we could create something meaningful that would outlast all of us. He wanted to call it the Everyday Angels Foundation, wanted to identify people in communities across the country who were making quiet differences, teachers paying for students' supplies out of their own pockets, firefighters coaching Little League on their days off, social workers staying late to help one more family, all the invisible labor that held society together but never got acknowledged or rewarded. And he wanted to provide micro-grants and scholarships and support systems that would let these people keep doing their important work without burning out or going broke in the process. The more he talked, the more I could see how my own experience could be a template, how my story of sacrifice and recognition could inspire others to nominate the heroes in their own communities. And I found myself getting excited despite my natural skepticism, found myself thinking that maybe this was why everything had happened the way it did, that maybe there was some larger purpose to years of struggle that I was only now beginning to understand. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in an orientation session at Columbia's Accelerated Nurse Practitioner program, surrounded by people 10 years younger than me who had taken traditional paths through their education while I had been raising a child and working full-time and putting my dreams in a locked box labeled someday. Richard had been true to his word, making calls and pulling strings, and somehow getting me accepted mid-semester into a program that normally had a 2-year waiting list, and the dean himself had called to say they were honored to have me, that my years of practical experience would be invaluable to the classroom environment, that I represented exactly the kind of dedicated professional they wanted to cultivate. The tuition was completely covered by a scholarship that Richard had personally funded, and I'd been given a laptop and textbooks and everything I needed to succeed, but more than the material support, what mattered was the message it sent, that someone believed in me enough to invest in my potential, that my dreams were worth pursuing even though I'd been ignoring them for years. I felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified, wondering if my 42-year-old brain could still absorb complex medical information at the pace required, wondering if I could balance school with work and family responsibilities. But then I remembered running into that smoke-filled subway station without hesitation, and I thought if I could do that, I could do this too. Fear wasn't a reason to stop. It was just information to acknowledge and move through. The foundation was officially launching next month with a gala fundraiser that Richard insisted I attend as guest of honor. And there would be media coverage and speeches and a video presentation about my subway rescue. And the thought of being that exposed and visible made my skin crawl. But I'd agreed because Richard explained that my story would open doors and checkbooks, that people would donate to support the mission if they could attach it to a compelling narrative. And I was learning that sometimes being uncomfortable was the price of doing good in the world. Dylan had been accepted to 3 universities and had chosen the one that gave him the best financial aid package, understanding now that money wasn't infinite and that his choices affected the whole family. And more than that, he'd started volunteering at a community center, teaching underprivileged kids about college applications, passing forward the help he'd received, embodying the pay-it-forward philosophy that Richard had articulated. Michael's company had stabilized after the cyber attack, and the stress that had been eating him alive for months had finally eased. And we'd started going to couples counseling because we'd realized that almost losing me had exposed cracks in our marriage that needed addressing, that we'd been functioning as co-parents and roommates rather than partners and lovers. And we were committed to finding our way back to each other instead of just coexisting in parallel misery. But life has a way of testing you right when you think you've figured things out, right when you start believing that maybe the universe is finally on your side. And the test came on a rainy Tuesday evening when I was walking home from class, exhausted from a 3-hour pharmacology lecture, but feeling good about the material, feeling like maybe I actually belonged in that classroom after all. I heard shouting from an alley, that particular quality of sound that immediately triggers alarm bells if you've spent any time working in emergency medicine. And every instinct told me to keep walking, to call 911 and let someone else handle it, to not risk myself again because I'd already been the hero once and that should be enough for one lifetime. But my feet stopped moving and then turned toward the alley before my brain could fully process the decision. And I saw two men standing over a third person lying on the ground, and the men were arguing about something while the person on the ground wasn't moving. And I knew with absolute certainty that this was a drug situation, probably an overdose, possibly a robbery, definitely dangerous, definitely something I should not be inserting myself into alone and unarmed. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 while walking into the alley, announcing myself loudly as a nurse, telling the men that help was coming and they should leave now if they didn't want to be there when police arrived. And one of them ran immediately, but the other one hesitated, looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, and said, "He's not breathing. We didn't mean for this to happen. We just wanted to get high. Please help him, please." The man ran then, disappearing into the rainy darkness, and I was alone with an unconscious 20-something kid who was indeed not breathing, whose lips were turning blue, who had all the signs of an opioid overdose, and I dropped to my knees in the dirty alley water and started checking for a pulse, for any sign of life, while talking to the 911 dispatcher and giving them the address and telling them to bring Narcan immediately. I started CPR, counting compressions, breathing into this stranger's mouth, tasting the rain and city grime, and thinking about how Dylan would react if something happened to me, if I died in this alley trying to save someone who might not even want to be saved, someone who had made choices that led to this moment. And I could hear my son's voice asking why I always had to be the hero, why I couldn't just walk away, why I couldn't put my own safety and my own family first for once. But I couldn't stop, couldn't walk away, because this was somebody's son lying in this alley, somebody's brother or boyfriend or friend, and maybe he'd made terrible choices, but he was still a human being, and his life still had value and potential. And who was I to decide that he didn't deserve a chance to change, to get clean, to become something better than what he was in this moment? The sirens were getting closer and I kept doing compressions, kept forcing oxygen into his lungs, kept refusing to let him die, and then suddenly he gasped and coughed and vomited, turning his head to the side, and his eyes fluttered open with that confused, disoriented look that people get when they're pulled back from the edge. And I felt that familiar rush of relief and purpose that came with saving a life. That feeling that made all the risk and fear worthwhile. The paramedics arrived and took over, and a police officer wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and took my statement. And he said, "Ma'am, you know this was incredibly dangerous. You could have been hurt or killed. These drug situations are unpredictable." And I nodded and said, I know. But we both knew I'd do it again, that this was just who I was, hardwired to help regardless of personal cost. News of the alley incident spread quickly because apparently someone in a nearby apartment had filmed part of it on their phone and posted it online. And within 24 hours, I was trending again, this time with headlines like "Subway Hero Strikes Again" and "NYC's Guardian Angel Saves Overdose Victim." And Richard called me sounding both proud and exasperated, saying, "Emma, you're going to give me a heart attack with these rescue missions, but also you're making my job incredibly easy because now everyone wants to know about the foundation and how they can support it." The young man I'd saved was named Marcus, and his mother found me through social media and came to my apartment crying and thanking me and saying her son had been struggling with addiction for 3 years, had been in and out of rehab multiple times, but this near-death experience had finally shocked him into real change, that he'd checked himself into a long-term treatment facility and was actually committed this time, actually ready to fight for his life the way I had fought to save it. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my hands as she left, and when I opened it later, I found a letter from Marcus himself, written in shaky handwriting that spoke of shame and gratitude and determination, saying that he'd been ready to die that night, had actually wanted the drugs to take him because living felt too hard, but waking up to see me covered in alley grime doing CPR had shown him that if a complete stranger thought his life was worth saving, maybe it actually was. Maybe he owed it to me and to himself to try harder, to be better, to prove that my effort hadn't been wasted on someone beyond redemption. The Foundation Gala arrived faster than I expected, a glittering evening at the Plaza Hotel with hundreds of New York's wealthiest and most influential people gathered in a ballroom that looked like something from a fairy tale, all crystal chandeliers and gold accents and women in gowns that cost more than my car. I felt completely out of place in a dress that Richard's wife Helen had insisted on buying me, professional hair and makeup that made me look like a stranger in the mirror, and Dylan kept taking pictures of me with his phone saying I looked like a movie star, while Michael held my hand and whispered that I was the most beautiful woman in the room, and I almost believed him even though I felt like an imposter playing dress-up. Richard gave a speech that made me cry, talking about how one moment of courage had inspired an entire movement, how my story had already generated over $2 million in donations and commitments, how the foundation would be able to support hundreds of everyday heroes across the country, providing grants and scholarships and recognition to people who had been invisible for too long. Then he called me up to the stage and I had to give my own speech, something I'd been dreading for weeks. But when I stood at that microphone looking out at all those expectant faces, I forgot my carefully prepared remarks and just spoke from the heart, telling them that I wasn't special, that there were thousands of people just like me in every city and town doing important work without recognition, and that the real miracle wasn't that I had saved 2 lives, it was that we were all here tonight ready to celebrate and support the quiet heroes who made civilization possible, the teachers and nurses and social workers and volunteers who showed up every day not for glory or money, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. The video presentation about my subway rescue played on giant screens, and I had to watch myself on that platform pulling people to safety, my face streaked with soot and determination, and it was strange seeing myself from outside, understanding for the first time why people kept calling me a hero, because the woman on that screen did look heroic, in a way I'd never felt internally. And maybe that's the secret of courage, that you never feel as brave as you appear to others, because from inside your own head, you're just terrified and acting anyway because someone needs help, and you're the one who's there. After the speeches, there was dinner and dancing and networking, and I met philanthropists and celebrities and politicians who all wanted to shake my hand and tell me how inspiring I was, and it was overwhelming and exhausting but also validating in a way I hadn't expected. Like maybe my years of sacrifice and service actually mattered, actually counted for something beyond just my own small family circle. Dylan danced with me, this boy who had called me useless just weeks ago, and he said quietly while we swayed to some Frank Sinatra song, "Mom, I get it now. I understand what you've been trying to teach me my whole life, that the point of being alive is to make things better for other people, to leave the world a little less broken than you found it. And I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. Sorry I was so selfish and blind." Michael cut in then, taking over the dance, and there was something in his eyes that reminded me of when we first met 20 years ago, that spark that had gotten buried under bills and stress and routine. And he said, "Emma Walker, you are the most extraordinary person I've ever known, and I'm sorry I forgot that somewhere along the way. Sorry I let the daily grind make me blind to the miracle of who you are." We kissed there on the dance floor, a real kiss full of promise and reconnection, and I felt like maybe we were finally finding our way back to each other, finally remembering why we'd chosen to build a life together in the first place. The evening ended with Richard announcing that the foundation had exceeded all fundraising goals and would be expanding faster than planned, opening regional offices and hiring a full staff, and that he wanted me to serve as chief of community outreach with a salary that made my hospital wages look like pocket change. And the whole room erupted in applause, and I stood there stunned and grateful and slightly terrified because this was happening so fast. My life was transforming at a pace I could barely process, but I knew I had to say yes, had to step into this opportunity even though it scared me, because Richard was right. I could identify and support other everyday heroes better than anyone because I understood what their lives looked like from the inside. 6 months passed in a blur of new routines and adjusted expectations, and I found myself living a life I wouldn't have recognized a year earlier, attending board meetings and charity functions while also staying enrolled in my nurse practitioner program, somehow balancing the foundation work with my education and with reduced hospital shifts that felt almost luxurious after years of grinding myself into dust. The foundation had identified and supported 47 everyday heroes across 12 states, providing everything from college tuition for a single mother paramedic in Oklahoma to new equipment for a volunteer firefighter in rural Montana, and each story reminded me why this work mattered, why Richard's gratitude-fueled vision had been worth pursuing. Dylan was thriving at university, calling home regularly not just when he needed something, but because he actually wanted to talk, actually wanted to share his experiences and hear about mine. And he'd started a campus organization focused on community service, recruiting other students to volunteer at local hospitals and shelters, embodying that pay-it-forward philosophy so completely that I sometimes wondered if he was the same angry teenager who'd called me useless just months ago. Michael had gotten a promotion at his newly stabilized company and was working reasonable hours again, coming home for dinner most nights, and we'd fallen back in love slowly and deliberately, dating each other again, remembering how to be partners instead of just co-parents surviving in the same house, and our counselor said we were her favorite success story, a couple who'd nearly lost everything but had found their way back stronger than before. But life's greatest tests often come disguised as ordinary moments, and mine came on a Saturday afternoon when I was at the foundation office reviewing grant applications, reading through dozens of nominations for remarkable people doing unremarkable work that kept communities functioning. And my phone rang with a call from Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, asking if I could come in immediately because there had been a mass casualty incident at a construction site, multiple injuries, and they needed all available experienced nurses, even though I was technically on my day off. I didn't hesitate, told them I'd be there in 20 minutes, and I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. But as I was leaving, I noticed one of the grant applications had fallen to the floor, and when I picked it up, I saw it was a nomination for a hospice nurse named Sarah Chen, who'd been working with terminal patients for 15 years, providing not just medical care, but emotional support and dignity to people in their final days, often staying hours past her shift to hold someone's hand while they died so they wouldn't be alone. And something about her story stopped me in my tracks, made me think about what kind of hero I wanted to be, whether I would always be the person running toward disasters and emergencies, or whether there was also value in the quieter, longer-term work of supporting people through ordinary suffering. I called Michael and told him about the hospital's request, and there was a pause on the line before he said carefully, "Emma, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I want you to ask yourself something. Are you going because they actually need you specifically, or are you going because you can't say no, because you're addicted to being needed, to being the hero who shows up and saves the day?" His words hit me hard because there was truth in them that I hadn't wanted to examine. Truth about how my identity had become so wrapped up in being the person who sacrificed and served that I didn't know who I was without that role. Didn't know how to just be Emma instead of Emma the hero, Emma the savior, Emma the one who always says yes. I told him I needed to think about it, and I sat back down at my desk and stared at Sarah Chen's application. And I realized that what she was doing, showing up day after day for patients no one could save, providing comfort instead of cure, staying present with death and grief and loss, was maybe even harder than running into burning buildings or doing CPR in dirty alleys, because there was no dramatic rescue, no moment of triumph, just the slow, faithful work of being there, of not turning away from suffering even when you couldn't fix it. I called the hospital back and told them I couldn't come in, that I trusted they had capable people who could handle the situation, that I needed to set boundaries around my time and energy if I was going to sustain this work for the long term instead of burning out spectacularly. And the administrator sounded surprised but understanding. And after I hung up, I felt simultaneously guilty and liberated, like I'd broken some unspoken rule, but also freed myself from an unsustainable pattern. I spent the rest of that afternoon reading through grant applications with new eyes, really seeing the people behind the nominations, the overnight security guard who mentored troubled teens, the librarian who taught ESL classes on weekends, the postal worker who checked on elderly people on his route, all of them showing up consistently without fanfare for work that would never trend on social media or get featured in gala videos. And I realized that maybe the Foundation's greatest contribution wouldn't be celebrating dramatic rescues, but recognizing this steady daily heroism that sustained communities over years and decades. When Michael got home that evening, I told him about my decision, and he pulled me into his arms and said he was proud of me, that learning to say no was just as important as knowing when to say yes, that sustainable service required boundaries and self-care and an understanding that you couldn't pour from an empty cup. And I felt something shift inside me, some knot of anxiety and obligation loosening just slightly. The real miracle came 2 weeks later when Sarah Chen, the hospice nurse, called me after receiving notification that she'd been selected for a foundation grant that would allow her to reduce her hours and attend a grief counseling certification program she'd been dreaming about for years. And her voice was thick with tears as she said, "I've been doing this work for so long without anyone noticing or caring, and I was starting to think maybe it didn't matter. Maybe I was wasting my life on something that made no difference. But this recognition, knowing that someone sees what I'm doing and values it, it's given me the strength to keep going, to keep showing up. For these patients who need someone to witness their final journey with compassion and dignity, I told her that she was exactly the kind of hero the Foundation was created to support, that her work was just as vital as any emergency rescue, maybe more so because it required sustained courage over years rather than a single moment of bravery. And after we hung up, I sat at my desk and cried, not sad tears, but grateful ones. Understanding finally that Richard's near-death experience and my subway rescue had been the catalyst for something much bigger than either of us, a movement that was shifting how society recognized and valued the people who held it together through quiet, faithful service. 1 year after the subway incident, I stood on that same platform, now beautifully renovated and featuring a plaque commemorating the rescue. And I was there with Richard and Helen and Dylan and Michael and a crowd of reporters and community members for the Foundation's anniversary celebration. And they were unveiling a new initiative called the Everyday Angels Network that would train and support people who wanted to become more active helpers in their communities, providing first aid certification and crisis intervention training and connecting volunteers with organizations that needed their skills. Marcus was there too, 10 months sober and working as a peer counselor at the treatment facility where he'd gotten clean. And when he spoke to the crowd about how my refusal to give up on him had saved his life twice, first physically in that alley and then spiritually by showing him that strangers could care about his survival, there wasn't a dry eye on the platform. Dylan had brought friends from his university service organization, and they were already signing up to be trained as community first responders. And I watched my son talking passionately about the importance of showing up for people, about how his mother had taught him that heroism wasn't about being fearless, but about acting despite fear because someone needed help. And I realized that maybe the greatest gift I'd given him wasn't college tuition or financial security, but a model of what it meant to live a life oriented towards service, towards something bigger than individual comfort and success. Richard announced that the foundation had now supported over 200 everyday heroes across 35 states and had raised enough money to sustain operations for at least 5 years, and that they were expanding internationally, planning to launch programs in communities around the world where ordinary people were doing extraordinary work without recognition or support. He thanked me again, said that none of this would have existed without my example, without my willingness to run toward danger when everyone else was running away. And I accepted his gratitude, but I also understood now that I hadn't been special or unique. I'd just been visible in a moment when cameras were rolling, when social media was watching, but there were millions of people just like me making similar choices in moments no one ever saw or celebrated. And the foundation's real work was making those people visible, telling their stories, supporting their efforts, creating a culture that valued service and sacrifice instead of just wealth and fame and individual achievement. Michael wrapped his arm around me as the ceremony continued, and he whispered, "I love you," in my ear. And those 3 simple words carried the weight of everything we'd been through, all the stress and disconnection and near breaking, and all the healing and reconnection and remembering why we'd chosen each other in the first place. And I whispered back, "I love you too," and meant it with my whole heart. The celebration moved into the newly renovated community center that the foundation had funded, and there was food and music and dancing, and I found myself talking to some of the other everyday heroes who'd been supported by grants and recognition, hearing their stories of teaching in underfunded schools and running food pantries and coaching youth sports and providing free legal aid, and each conversation reinforced my understanding that heroism wasn't rare or exceptional. It was everywhere, woven into the fabric of communities by people who showed up consistently and refused to look away from need and suffering. Sarah Chen was there, and we hugged like old friends, even though we'd never met in person before. And she told me about her grief counseling program and how it was transforming her ability to support both patients and their families through the dying process. And I told her about my nurse practitioner studies and how I was planning to open a practice that focused on underserved communities, providing care to people who fell through the cracks of the healthcare system. And we made plans to collaborate, to create a model that integrated end-of-life care with community health services. And I felt excited about the future in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, I stood on the subway platform one more time, looking at the plaque with my name on it. And I thought about that morning 1 year ago when I'd been so tired and beaten down, when Dylan had called me useless, and I'd believed him on some level, when I'd felt invisible and unappreciated and worn down to nothing by years of grinding service without recognition. I thought about how a single moment of crisis had revealed something I'd forgotten about myself, something that had always been there but had gotten buried under exhaustion and routine. And I understood now that the miracle wasn't that I'd saved Richard's life or Marcus's life. The miracle was that their gratitude had saved mine, had pulled me out of the invisible grinding existence I'd been living and shown me that my years of service and sacrifice had meaning, had value, had created ripples that extended far beyond what I could see or measure. Dylan came and stood beside me, this young man who looked so much like his father but had my eyes, my determination, my instinct towards service. And he said, "Mom, I was thinking about what I want to do with my life, and I've decided to go into social work. I want to help people the way you've helped people. I want to make a difference the way you've made a difference. And I know it won't be easy and I won't get rich, but I've learned from watching you that a meaningful life is worth more than a comfortable one." I pulled him into a hug and felt my heart might burst with pride and love and gratitude for this second chance we'd been given, this opportunity to rebuild our family on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values instead of just obligation and routine. Michael joined us on the platform and wrapped his arms around both of us, creating a circle of 3, and we stood there in silence for a moment, just being together, just appreciating the miracle of this ordinary moment after so much chaos and transformation. The next train pulled into the station, and people got on and off, rushing to their destinations, living their own complicated lives, and I thought about how many of them were probably heroes in their own quiet ways, showing up for their families and communities, making sacrifices no one would ever know about, keeping the world spinning through sheer force of will and love. And I felt connected to all of them, part of a vast network of people who'd decided that service mattered more than comfort, that helping others was worth the cost even when no one was watching or applauding. We rode the subway home together, my husband and my son and me, and I looked at my reflection in the dark window and saw not the tired, beaten-down woman from a year ago, but someone who'd been transformed by being seen, by having her quiet heroism recognized and celebrated. And I understood finally that we all need to be seen. We all need to have our efforts acknowledged. We all need someone to say, "What you're doing matters. Keep going. You're making a difference." Because that recognition gives us the strength to keep serving, keep showing up, keep running toward danger and difficulty when every instinct says to run away. When we got home, there was a package waiting on our doorstep, and inside was a letter from the mayor's office informing me that I'd been selected as one of New York's Citizens of the Year, that there would be a ceremony at City Hall and a profile in the city magazine. And Dylan laughed and said, "Mom, you're famous now. You're basically a celebrity." And I shook my head and said, "No, baby. I'm just someone who did what needed doing and got lucky enough to be seen doing it. The real celebrities are all the people doing the same thing every day without cameras or recognition, without foundations or ceremonies, just showing up because it's right, because someone needs help, because that's what it means to be human." And as I said those words, I realized they were true. Realized that my year of transformation had taught me that heroism wasn't about being exceptional. It was about being consistently present, about refusing to look away from suffering, about believing that every life had value and deserved to be fought for. And that lesson, more than any plaque or award or recognition, was the real miracle that had emerged from that morning in the subway when I'd stopped running away from who I was and started running toward it instead. The end, or really the beginning.